It is so good to see everybody this evening for Sunday night. And we've been preaching through, as I mentioned, the letter to the Philippian church, Paul's letter to the Philippian church. And I was having a bit of a think about our reading this evening, and we really see a real team of people who are out to spread the good news of Jesus, the way of Jesus. And I've titled this sermon, Teammates in the Gospel Work, because I think that we don't really do gospel work alone. Now, some of you know that I play soccer on Friday evenings. There is a picture of me on the bench. That was my first game. And they were still working out what I was doing and how fit I was and what I couldn't do. Turns out there are many things I can't do on a soccer field. But that was a really fun evening. I thought, I'd like to show you guys a photo of that. And that's out with the local Gresford girls. Because Dungog play on a Sunday. And I'm like, oh, girls, I work on a Sunday. At one day a week. No, just joking. But I do work on a Sunday. It's a little bit hard to get there. These girls play Friday night, so that's really helpful. It's been a fun time being able to run around, get out some of the energy that gets pent up. I'm a bit of a physical person. I do like to kind of move and get some of that energy out rather than kind of sitting all day and studying or praying or whatever it is us priests get up to, having coffee with people down the road. But it helps me just kind of regulate my need for activity and my need for connection, so I have a bit of both. But now they've got me playing goalkeeper, so I'm the goalkeeper for the team, which is fantastic and it's great fun, but it's one of those last line of defence type positions, and when it can get very stressful very quickly. You think you're all good, and then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, there's someone coming at me, and there are no defenders, and it's 1-1, that's when it gets really stressful. I mean, we're D grade, it's just a bit of fun, but gosh, it can get stressful. But the point of soccer is that it's a team sport, right? It's not just, thank God, it's not just me who goes hoping to win or lose the game. It's a team sport, it's a team effort, and that's what we see in our reading this evening from Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. So we see that this letter to the Philippians is doing a few things for us here in modern day Dungog. It's telling us about what God is like, and we see that in the suffering servant of Jesus. A couple of weeks ago we read about Jesus' example to us of what it is to be a servant. We also see how we are justified in God's eyes. Justification through baptism. Sanctification is a process, becoming holy. It doesn't happen overnight. God works on our lives and works with us to become holy and be more like Him. And of course, our glorification with Him in heaven. And it also tells us a bit what the church is like. What the church is like here for us, but what the church was like in the early church as well. Now, we are about halfway through Paul's letter to the Philippians. It's actually really lovely because it breaks down into 10 chunks. And there are 10 Sunday nights this year because I was a little bit late coming back from Canterbury. So there were only 10. And we have 4 Sunday nights until December. Just to give you a bit of an idea of how close that's coming. That helps me remember that it's coming up very quickly. So 4 more Sunday nights. There's 4 more parts to this letter. Now, remembering Paul wrote this letter to a church that he had started in the Greek city of Philippi. So he was someone who had planted a congregation, he had gotten people together, told them the good news of Jesus, and they met just like this, maybe without the technology, but they still met together and shared meals and encouraged each other and told each other about the way of Jesus. Now, he's writing to the Philippians while he is under house arrest. Remembering that Paul it was never an easy life for Paul, except in his early life, but when he was a missionary and telling people about the way of Jesus, his life got very hard very quickly. So he's currently under house arrest. It tells us about, this letter tells us about a God that is self-emptying and humble. And we see this a lot in Paul's changed nature as he goes around and tells the good news of Christ. Now, this passage is broken up into two parts. That's Paul talking about his teammates for the spread of the gospel. He's got someone called Timothy and another guy called Epaphroditus. I did look up how to say it. I will tell you that. I will be vulnerable and tell you that I didn't know how to say the Greek word Epaphroditus, but we got there. And it brings me to this first point, friends. We need friends for mission. We need friends for mission. I was drawn to this passage this week because it came up in what we're preaching, but also I really connected with it because when I first began ministering, it was always in a team. It was never a one-person show. And like my soccer girls, we can get something big achieved when we work together. We see that in our church, certainly. But it's the same when we're tasked with building God's church, discipling new believers, bringing people together. It's a team effort, right? Which we're seeing tonight in what we're doing here. And it was really brought home to me this week because as if you were at the morning services or saw our Facebook, my friend Elizabeth preached for us this morning, and she was the first person I ever ministered with. And I reckon she was a little bit like my Timothy, although she may have been Paul. I don't know who's who, because Timothy's sort of the latecomer to the party. So maybe I'm the Timothy and she's the Paul, but I want to be Paul. So, friends, in the very beginning of the letter to the church in Philippi, we see that this letter is from Paul to his friend Timothy. And Acts 16 says Timothy was a convert of Paul, so that probably means that I'm the Timothy and Liz is the Paul, but that's okay. And he went on to be Paul's companion. He was his right-hand man on many of his missionary journeys. You see Timothy throughout Paul's letters. He's always being written to. There's even letters to Timothy in Paul's writings. And his name means one who honours God. That's what the name Timothy means. And from all accounts, he lived up to that name, really. The Philippians knew him. He planted the church with Paul, and he helped plant lots of churches. He raised up people to serve in those churches, leaving to go on to the next city and start all over again. So Timothy was the right man for the job. Now, he probably didn't look like it on first impression, because in other parts of the Bible, Paul talks about Timothy's being quite timid. He probably didn't have a lot of confidence to begin with. But he was just a regular guy. He was someone who Jesus saved and Paul discipled, and that was willing to bet his life on Jesus' square. You know, it's almost like a bit of a gamble, but he knew that there was something about Jesus, and he was discipled into the faith. So Paul knows the Philippians will be blessed by someone who's genuinely concerned for their welfare, like we all are. You know, we are blessed by people who are genuinely concerned for us. Paul knows it. He's been blessed by Timothy's generosity as well, and his care for his well-being. He's got no one else like Timothy. Timothy's his MVP, if we want to continue to use the sport metaphor, the most valuable player. And it's a bit like he's just a dependable friend, the person you can depend on. That's what's happening for Paul and Timothy. Timothy's a great friend to Paul, and really we all need a Timothy in our lives. And especially as people who are sent on mission, as Elizabeth reminded us today. Now, and you can see Timothy's the words about him on the screen. Now, in chapter 2 of the letter we examined about a month ago, Paul tells the Philippians, as I said, about Jesus as an example of humility and sacrifice. And this verse reads a bit like a description of Paul's travels, but then we see the connection Paul's making here. He's comparing Timothy and Epaphroditus to Jesus. So it's showing about the pouring out of people looking after others as Christ looks after us. So let's see what Paul has to say about this guy, Epaphroditus, because he's saying Timothy and Epaphroditus are models of Christian discipleship that we can follow, but also that the Philippians can follow too. Now this guy, Epaphroditus, with a funny name, he was a Philippian sent by the church to look after Paul. So Paul was in prison and the Philippians were worried about him. They also had a really lovely connection, this Philippian church and Paul. They were so worried about him, they sent someone to Paul to see how he was going. He's probably like a pastoral visitor, really. He went back to see how Paul was doing. And he brought gifts that Paul thanks them for later in chapter 4. But it wasn't an easy trip, and we see in these verses here that, no, not those ones. The next one, do I have them on there? No, I missed it. That's okay. In verse 27, it says that Epaphroditus nearly dies from an illness. He was quite unwell. So Paul sent him back. But as he sent him back, he honoured him. And it says here in verse 25 that Epaphroditus is a brother, a fellow worker, a fellow soldier, a messenger, and a minister. Paul is really loving on this guy, Epaphroditus. He calls him a brother. They're not just friends, they're brothers because of Christ. The early church lived in a world with the same divisions we face, political divisions and all sorts of other things. But the gospel of Jesus united these previously separate people, not into an organisation, but into a family. And friends, we become family by virtue of our baptism. So we gathered here together tonight as family because we're all baptised. We're baptised people here in the house of God. And we know families aren't always perfect. They're not always perfect, and that's okay. But the difference is we're joined by our faith, not just how we happened to be born. So Epaphroditus is not just a good Christian. He was a good Christian worker. He worked for the Lord. He worked for the sake of the gospel. He worked hard. But it's important, though, to understand, like we talked about last month, we don't work for our salvation. That's already given to us through the grace of Jesus Christ, our baptism, and so on and so forth. But once we are saved, we are deployed. We are put out on mission. And for some, as Elizabeth said this morning, that might look like making cups of tea for people, having hospitality for others, sent on mission. Paul calls Epaphroditus a soldier as well, fellow soldier. He fought against the opposition to Christ's work in the world, because there is opposition to Christ's work in the world, friends. The work you do for Jesus sometimes is more like a battle than a job. We are always in a spiritual war because there is an enemy trying to steal our hearts away from Jesus. So Epaphroditus is a soldier in this war as well. So Paul's words last month were about the beauty of Jesus' humble sacrifice. But a question begins to surface perhaps for us: can I expect to find that same beauty among his followers? I mean, if it's Jesus' church, shouldn't his humble sacrificial service be shown in the church through and through? Paul says it does, and in this passage he shows us example A and B, Timothy and Epaphroditus, proving the gospel of Jesus isn't just something good to think about, but creates a beautiful culture to live inside. See, it changes the way people do things, Christianity. That's what's so beautiful about it. It changes our whole lives. Timothy and Epaphroditus are proof that the gospel is real. I mean, why would you work so hard and suffer and put others' interests above your own without the good of the gospel? So, our lives bear witness to the fact that Jesus suffered and died. And if others see in us the same kind of Christ-centered self-sacrifice, they can see the truth of the gospel through our works. That doesn't mean when we fail, the gospel is less true, of course. We're imperfect and we own our imperfection through that vulnerable self-love of going, I am not perfect, but I am someone who is sent on mission for Jesus Christ and I can be used by God. But we see, and others can see, the sacrifice and service and love and care for one another. They will know us through those fruits. But we don't do it without Jesus, of course. Christ not only shows us the way, he is the way. He not only commands us to go and live likewise, he invites us into himself, comes to us by his Spirit, and empowers us to live self-sacrificial lives. Friends, we will never care well for others until we first see and accept, as well, this is the tricky part sometimes, how Jesus cares for us. To know that you are loved by Jesus, because you can only give what you have. So you have to accept that Christ loves you in your imperfection and then give that to others. We deeply need to see the kind of care Jesus has for us. So we've got to own that first and give that to others like Epaphroditus and Timothy. And that's why we never outgrow the gospel. Every day I wake up needing a fresh dose of the gospel, and I reckon we all do too. So I need to come to Jesus. I need to behold his love in the gospel. I need to see that every need I have has provision and in abundance of himself. And as I receive care from the Lord, I can give that care to others. Our path forward is always beholding Jesus. Jesus cares for us. He cared for Paul. Paul cared for Timothy and Epaphroditus. They cared for the church in Philippi, and so on it goes. So Dungog Church, we have the call on our lives to be like Timothy and Epaphroditus. The church in Dungog, as I said, I've always said I wish we had a letter to the church in Dungog. Wouldn't that be cool from Paul? We are sent. We are people who are sent on mission. We're called to bring others joy, to be genuinely concerned for the welfare of others, to have empathy, and to be interested in what Christ is interested in, and to serve each other for the sake of the gospel. But why would we do this, apart from being sent on mission by God? Well, the whole theme of the letter to the Philippians is joy. Joy in persecution, joy in hard times. And joy is not happiness. Joy is very different. Joy is something very different from happiness. It's not dependent on the situation. Joy comes from living a Christian life in community and knowing that each of us has eternal worth and value, and our own eternal worth and value. We are made in the image of God. You are made in the image of God. It's called the Imago Dei. It's found in Genesis 1:27, if you want to look it up. We are made in the image of God. We believe that God gives every human being worth. So Paul isn't talking about Timothy's proven worth or Epaphroditus' proven worth. He is saying that he has worth, and so does Epaphroditus, in the fact that they are humans, made in the image of God and sent on mission to tell other people that they are made in the image of God. Because there aren't a lot of people that know that. We know that because we're here at church, but there are not a lot of people that would consider themselves made holy in the image of God. So, Timothy and Epaphroditus and Paul were great pastors, but they're nothing compared to Jesus, the greatest pastor, who not only Nelly dies.
CT76 CKNQ disconnected.
I knew I was 1 minute over. But Jesus not only nearly dies in your service, he actually dies to save you, to save me from our sins. He died to give you his kingdom, his righteousness, his very life. Friends, look to him. Keep looking at him. Look at him some more. And then we can truly live the kind of Christian life he calls us to live.